The president just had comments in the last hour, and he did not meet with Democrats on infrastructure as had been scheduled for today. The president instead held a press event moments ago, and he gave his reasons for missing the meeting with the Democrats.
I want to do infrastructure. I want to do it more than you want to do it. I'd be really good at that. That's what I do. But you know what? You can't do it under these circumstances. So get these phony investigations over with.
Joining us from Washington is our Yahoo correspondent, Jessica Smith. And so Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, they've also made some comments. Did we learn, or what did we learn from them?
Well, we'll give you a little bit of backstory and what went on here. They were supposed to meet on infrastructure at 11:15, and just before that, Pelosi had a meeting with top Democrats talking about their oversight measures, what they're doing on those investigations. She came out of that meeting on her way to the White House and said that they believe the president is involved in a cover-up. The president took issue with that statement and came out to the Rose Garden and told reporters that he briefly met with Schumer and Pelosi just to tell them until they get these investigations over with, he is not going to work with them on infrastructure. He says, get the investigations over with, and then we can work on infrastructure and things like prescription drugs. He, of course, thinks these are phony investigations. He's called them a witch hunt over and over again. He went on to say that he's been the most transparent president in history, and so he does not think he engages in a cover-up, as Pelosi accused him of this morning. So we just heard from Speaker Pelosi and Minority Leader Schumer. Pelosi said they had wanted to work together with him on infrastructure, but for some reason, she says, maybe lack of confidence on his part that he couldn't address the infrastructure challenge, he had to take a pass. Minority Leader Schumer also talked about this. Here's how he described the meeting.
To watch what happened in the White House would make your jaw drop.
So he says that Schumer says that he was ready with a 35-page plan, all of these details of what they wanted to see from infrastructure, but the president was not ready. He accuses the president of planning this before the cover-up comment happened. He says this was planned before this morning. He accuses the president of not being able to come up with funding ideas for infrastructure. So as Schumer puts it, he had to run away. So bottom line here is it doesn't look like infrastructure is going anywhere at the moment. And the president says he's not going to work with Democrats on other issues either.
We'll make them all go stand in the corner and think about what they've just done. Jess, thank you. Joining us to continue this discussion, Infrastructure Capital Advisors founder and CEO Jay Hatfield. There are a lot of details to get to, but I have to ask you to react to what we're witnessing between the Democrats and the president.
Well, I guess the president sort of stole my thunder, because I was going to say that it was extremely unlikely that we had a infrastructure bill, but now that's sort of blatantly obvious. But the real problem, of course, is the pay force. And since Republicans are against new taxes, then sort of by definition, extremely difficult to have an infrastructure bill. One point, though, since we focus on energy infrastructure, that's important, is that we really don't need public financing for energy infrastructure. They're highly economic projects. So really, it's a permitting issue. And the Trump administration actually has been quite conducive to long-haul pipelines from a federal perspective. But what's dominant is really the states, because they can hold up projects through environmental permits. And that's one reason, for instance, in New York, we actually are starting to have shortages of natural gas because we can't permit pipelines. Con Ed just announced that. In Boston, they're burning fuel oil, which is not just from a carbon perspective, but a soot perspective, extremely unattractive, because they can't site pipelines, even though there's tremendous natural gas production in the Appalachia Mountains. And we're exporting it to Saudi Arabia. We can't even get it to Boston. So it's kind of unfortunate. But that's a state issue, so it can't really be dealt with at the federal level. And as I mentioned, it's not FERC or the federal government that's constraining, it's really the states. And then, but conversely, in Texas, where the Permian Basin is and most of the incremental production is coming from, that's in Texas. That's extremely friendly to energy companies, obviously, and there's a tremendous infrastructure going in there by the private sector.
Jay, putting aside the energy question for a moment, more broadly on infrastructure, as you say, energy is more privately funded. There's an economic interest.
Right.
Why don't we see more other types of infrastructure projects like we do in Europe, for example, that are more privately funded, privately run, et cetera?
Well, I think there's a little bit of a misconception about Europe versus the US. So since we're in New York, we can see that the airports are being rebuilt. LaGuardia, if you've been out of there recently, there's billions been going in there. Terminal 4 in JFK.
I mean, when aren't airports being
They've got that one nice wing now.
Right? I mean,
But I think a little bit of the misconception is that in Europe, they have these beautiful airports, but they're really just big shopping centers, and it's driven by VAT attempts to avoid the VAT.
Tax,
So they can build these palaces that are sort of like our, huge retail centers, but they're in their airports. But we
Jay,
don't have that subsidy.
isn't it starting here as well? Because public-private partnerships are starting to take place in some major airports here in the United States. I know it's taking place out in St. Louis. The FAA has actually been a roadblock here. The regulatory environment really is holding back a lot of things that could take place, both on the level that you just mentioned on permitting, but other areas like this where airports, which are in desperate need of repair, we look nothing like Europe.
Yeah, well, I would still argue that because the airlines are highly motivated to have this happen and they actually contribute, that there are a lot of projects happening. And the notion that we just have horrible airport infrastructure, I think, is a little bit of a misnomer. I mean,
You're talking to a pilot.
yeah, but I mean, it could be better, and it'd be nicer if we had some gigantic retail place in JFK that was more beautiful than Europe. But if you try to, got back from a conference in Las Vegas. There's literally hundreds of flights that you can take, and so it's not like you can't get around the United States.
Because of regulations, a lot of the money is misplaced. A lot of very small airports that don't have any traffic get enormous amounts of money, and then the big airports that are getting all the traffic don't get enough to.
Well, and of course, air traffic control would be an area where they actually could put more money in, and that's often a constraint, and that's a huge problem, and that's controlled by the federal government. So that would be something where there should be a bill. But the notion is going to be stuck in some gigantic infrastructure bill, and we're all going to get together and agree on that. Obviously, I was going to mention the investigations, but Trump, made it, put it to the forefront. I think is a little bit unlikely.
Okay. Jay, we got to end it there. I want to bring you back, though, especially when we start talking about air traffic control and attempts to privatize all of that. InfraCap Capital Advisors founder and CEO, Jay Hatfield. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Jay.